The air up here in Sequoia Ridge had a taste to it, a clean, sharp flavor of pine and cold stone that scoured the city from your lungs. For me, it was the taste of peace. For Lena, it was a novelty, a welcome escape. When her car pulled up the gravel drive to my ranger station, kicking up a plume of dust that shimmered in the late afternoon sun, I felt a familiar warmth spread through my chest. She stepped out, a splash of color against the endless green and brown, her artist's eyes already drinking in the panorama of giant, silent trees. "Mark," she said, her voice a melody that the gruff landscape desperately needed. She closed the distance between us and wrapped her arms around my neck. "God, I've missed this. And you." "Missed the dirt and the quiet more, I bet," I teased, kissing her. She smelled of canvas and turpentine, the scent of her own kind of creation. Inside, the station was rustic and functional, my whole life distilled into a single cavernous room with a loft for sleeping. While I made coffee, Lena wandered, her fingers tracing the spines of my field guides and the grain of the heavy oak desk. She stopped at the small, dark wood chest by the hearth. "Is this—" "Yep," I said, bringing over 2 steaming mugs. "Grandpa's?" I knelt and lifted the heavy lid. Inside, nestled in faded velvet, lay the source of 100 family stories, his collection of old silver dollars, Morgans and peace dollars, heavy and tarnished with age. I picked one up, its heft familiar in my palm. He collected them his whole life, said silver was honest, held its value when paper and promises failed. Lena picked one up, her delicate artist's fingers a stark contrast to the worn, heavy coin. "They're beautiful. So much history in them." She looked up at me, her eyes shining. "I'm so glad I'm here, Mark. I think I could get used to this. Maybe for good." The words hung in the air, a promise of a future I'd barely dared to dream of. The next day, I took her on my favorite patrol route, the Sleeper's Giant Trail. It snaked through a grove of the oldest sequoias, trees that were ancient when Rome was just a village. "All right, city girl," I said, pointing to a set of tracks in the soft earth. "Pop quiz, what went through here?" She squinted. "A very large dog?" "Close. Black bear. See how the claw marks don't show? They retract like a cat's. A grizzly's would be obvious." I showed her how the moss grew thickest on the north side of the trunks, a living compass. I had her close her eyes and listen, picking out the chatter of a Steller's jay from the whistle of a varied thrush. We stood before a behemoth of a tree, its bark scarred with deep parallel gashes 10 feet off the ground. "That's a bear, too. A big one, marking his territory." She leaned against me, her head on my shoulder. "You belong here. You're part of it." "We could be," I said, and the silence that followed was comfortable, full of unspoken understanding. And then it changed. It wasn't a sound, but the absence of it. The birds stopped singing. The insects fell silent. Every tiny noise that made up the lifeblood of the forest was suddenly, unnervingly gone. I felt the hair on my arms stand up. The air grew thick, heavy, carrying a faint, gag-inducing odor. It was the smell of a wet dog left to rot, a coppery tang of decay underneath. "Mark?" Lena's voice was a whisper. "Don't move," I said, my own voice low and tight. My hand went to the Glock on my hip, the practiced motion smooth and automatic. I unsnapped the holster. The silence was absolute now, a crushing weight. It came from the dense thicket of ferns to our left, a blur of motion too fast to properly see. It wasn't a bear. It was a nightmare given flesh, unfolding itself from the shadows. It rose onto 2 legs, standing nearly 7 feet tall, a spindly, powerful frame of wrongness. Its head was long and canine, a wolf's snout filled with yellowed teeth. But its eyes were a burning, intelligent yellow. Its arms were too long, ending in black, ragged claws. The world slowed to a crawl. I shoved Lena hard, screaming, "Get back!" She stumbled and fell as the creature lunged. I was already raising my pistol, but it was so damn fast. It wasn't on me, it was on her. It swiped, and a sickening screech of tearing fabric and flesh filled the air. It knocked her to the ground like a rag doll. I fired. The first shot was wild. The second hit it in the torso with a wet thud. It didn't even flinch, just turned its burning yellow eyes on me, a low growl rumbling in its chest. I kept firing, the explosions of the gun deafening in the dead silent woods. Another bullet struck its shoulder. It roared in fury, not pain. Then came the sound that broke me. A short, strangled cry from Lena, followed by a wet, tearing crunch as the thing's jaws clamped down on her shoulder. It was the sound of my world being ripped apart. Blinded by rage and terror, I emptied the magazine. One of the last rounds found its mark. It struck the creature just below its left eye. The effect was instantaneous. It let out a high-pitched, piercing shriek of agony, a sound utterly alien. It thrashed its head, releasing Lena, and scrambled back into the undergrowth with impossible speed. The forest swallowed it, leaving only the sound of snapping branches, the coppery smell of blood, and a silence that felt heavier than before. I scrambled to Lena. Her arm and shoulder were a ruin, a crimson mess of shredded muscle and splintered bone. Shock had bleached her face of all color. I tore off my uniform shirt, bundling it into a makeshift bandage, trying to staunch the bleeding. I lifted her into my arms. She felt terrifyingly light, and began the long, agonizing trek back to the station. My mind was a whirlwind of impossible images, of yellow eyes and the sound of tearing flesh. But one clear, cold thought rose above the panic. No one would ever believe me. They'd lock me up. And as I stumbled through the woods, carrying the shattered remains of my wife, the lie was born. It wasn't a choice. It was a necessity. It was a bear, I whispered to her, though she was barely conscious. A black bear, a rogue, just a very, very big bear. I burst through the emergency room doors of Sierra Valley General like a man possessed, Lena limp in my arms. The sterile scent of antiseptic and floor wax was a jarring slap in the face after the primal odor of the woods. "Help!" I yelled, my voice raw. "Bear attack! She was attacked by a bear!" The controlled chaos of the ER swirled around us. Nurses and orderlies descended, their faces a mixture of professional calm and alarm. They whisked Lena away on a gurney, a blur of blue scrubs and urgent voices. I was left standing there, covered in her blood, my fabricated story tumbling out of my mouth to a tired-looking cop and a doctor with a clipboard. A black bear came out of nowhere. A big one. A male, I think. A typical aggression. The head physician, a man named Dr. Evans with weary eyes and a steady demeanor, found me in the waiting room an hour later. "Mr. Riley, I'm Dr. Evans. We've stabilized your wife. She's in surgery now. The damage is extensive. You're a very lucky man. And so is she. Will she be okay?" The words felt like sandpaper in my throat. He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "She lost a lot of blood. The wound is severe. Multiple muscle groups, the brachial plexus. It's a mess. Honestly, the bite pattern is unusual. It's more of a tear than a crush. Almost like a wolf. But the jaw size, in the heat of the moment, I'm sure a man could mistake one predator for another. It was a bear. I repeated, the lie feeling like a lead weight in my gut. I'm a park ranger. I know what I saw. He just nodded, his expression giving nothing away. Lena was in the hospital for a week. A long, agonizing week where I sat by her bedside watching her sleep, haunted by the memory of yellow eyes. I was drowning in guilt. I was the expert. I was supposed to keep her safe. I had led her to the monster. On the third day, something strange happened. The surgeon who had operated on Lena, a younger, more excitable man, called Dr. Evans to her room while I was there. He was holding her chart, his brow furrowed. "I've never seen anything like it, Frank," the surgeon said, keeping his voice low. "The inflammation is almost non-existent. The tissue granulation, it's regenerating at a rate that just isn't possible. Look at these cultures. No sign of infection, despite the filth that must have been in that wound." A nurse chimed in from the doorway. "Her blood work is strange too, doctor. Her growth hormone levels, her white cell count, everything is off the charts. It's like her body is rebuilding itself on overdrive." Dr. Evans stood over Lena's sleeping form, a deep, thoughtful frown on his face. He looked at the slowly healing but still horrific wound on her shoulder, then at me. "How is she, mentally?" "Nightmares," I said, my voice hollow. "She screams in her sleep." They discharged her a week after the attack. By all medical metrics, she was healing at a miraculous rate. The shredded flesh was knitting itself back together, leaving behind a puckered, angry scar that was already starting to fade to a silvery gray. Dr. Evans signed the papers, but he wasn't happy about it. "Mark," he said, pulling me aside as I prepared to wheel Lena out. "I'm still putting bear attack on the official record, but I'm a man of science, and what I've seen this week doesn't fit our models. Watch her. Watch her closely. If you notice anything out of the ordinary, you call me. Immediately." We drove home in silence. The ranger station, once my sanctuary, felt ominous. The familiar shadows of the sequoias seemed to press in on all sides. As I helped Lena inside, my eyes fell on the kitchen calendar. A picture of Yosemite Valley, cheerful and bright. I walked over and picked up a pen. The date of the attack was already past. I found the next full moon on the calendar and drew a stark black circle around it. 22 days. A countdown to something I didn't have a name for. The nightmares were only the beginning. Her senses, always sharp, became unnervingly acute. She'd jump at the sound of a floorboard creaking in a way she never had before. One night I found her standing stock-still in the kitchen, her head cocked. "There's a mouse in the wall," she whispered, her eyes wide. "I can hear its heart beating." The most disturbing sign came a few days later. I was cleaning out the small hospital bag she'd brought home and found, tucked into a side pocket, a small, foil-wrapped package. It was a raw, half-eaten pork chop, stolen from the hospital kitchen. When I confronted her, a look of profound shame and confusion washed over her face. I don't know," she stammered, tears welling in her eyes. "I was just so hungry." That evening I sat down at my desk to write the official incident report for the Park Service. My fingers trembled as I typed. I lied about everything that mattered. I changed the location of the attack, moving it 5 miles south to a rocky, inaccessible canyon. I described the animal as a standard, 250-pound black bear, spooked by our presence. I detailed my own actions, painting a picture of a textbook defensive encounter. Every word was a betrayal of my oath, a felony committed to protect a truth far more terrible than any crime. The weight of it settled on my soul, cold and heavy as a coffin lid. The 22 days bled into one another, each one a slow, agonizing tick of a clock I could hear in my own pulse. The changes in Lena were no longer subtle. They were a rising tide of wrongness, eroding the woman I loved piece by piece. Her heightened senses became a torment. The scent of me frying bacon for breakfast one morning sent her retching into the sink. "It's too much," she'd gasp, holding her head. "The smell, the sound, it's all too loud." She could hear the scuttling of beetles under the floorboards, the flutter of a moth's wings outside the window. Her personality, once warm and open, began to close in on itself. She grew irritable, prone to sudden flashes of anger over nothing. Her movements, once graceful, became jerky, angular, and unsettlingly predatory. She'd pace the length of the cabin for hours, a caged thing wearing my wife's face. The incident with the stolen pork chop was not an isolated one. I came home from a patrol one afternoon to find her on the kitchen floor, surrounded by the torn packaging of a pound of raw ground beef. She was cramming it into her mouth with her bare hands, her face a mask of primal hunger. When she saw me, she flinched back, a low growl catching in her throat before it was choked off by a sob of self-loathing. She scrambled away from the meat as if it were poison, curling into a ball in the corner, weeping. "I don't know why I did it, Mark. I can't stop it." Her body was beginning to betray her in more visible ways. Her lustrous brown hair started to fall out in clumps, clogging the shower drain. The skin around the scar on her shoulder was changing, becoming tough, leathery, and tinged with a grayish pallor. Worst of all were the cramps. They'd hit her without warning, usually at night. Vicious, full-body spasms that would contort her limbs, arching her back until I thought her spine would snap. Her screams of agony would echo through the silent woods, and I could do nothing but hold her, feeling the unnatural heat radiating from her skin and the terrifying strength in her convulsing muscles. The full moon was now less than a week away. Desperation was a physical clawing in my gut. I started tearing through the station's small library, a collection of historical texts and local guides I'd inherited with the post. I wasn't looking for science anymore. Science had failed. I was looking for anything else. In a dusty, leather-bound volume titled Folklore and Legends of the Klamath River Basin, I found it. It was a chapter on the myths of the local Yurok tribe. They told stories of a creature, a shapeshifter, a man-eater that stalked the deep forests. They didn't call it a werewolf. Their name for it was different, older. But the description was exact. A tall, bipedal canine figure, disproportionately long limbs, burning, intelligent eyes, an ancient evil, born not of a curse but of a bite, an infection of the soul passed from one creature to the next. My blood ran cold. The book fell from my numb fingers. I looked at the crude, woodblock print illustration on the page. It was the thing from the woods. It was the thing that had attacked us. I found Lena sitting by the window, staring out at the darkening trees. She was shivering, wrapped in a thick blanket despite the warmth of the cabin. I sat down beside her, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the open book. "Lena," I said, my voice cracking, "that bite? The thing in the forest." I didn't need to finish. She turned to look at me, and her eyes were vast pools of terror and resignation. The fight had gone out of her. All that was left was a horrifying certainty. "I feel it, Mark," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Her gaze drifted past me, to the window where the first sliver of the rising moon was just cresting the ridge. "It's waiting. It's been waiting for the moon." In that moment, we were no longer a husband and wife facing a medical mystery. We were two people staring into an abyss of impossible, ancient horror. The truth, now that it was here, was worse than any fear I could have imagined. The sun bled its last orange and purple hues below the horizon. The forest fell into its twilight hush. Lena let out a low moan, a sound that started deep in her chest. Her body went rigid. Her back arched in a spasm far more violent than any before, her joints popping with a series of sickening cracks. Her skin seemed to stretch taut over her bones, the structure of her face shifting beneath it. The full white disk of the moon cleared the treetops, flooding the cabin with its cold, dead light. Lena's moan twisted, deepened, and tore itself from her throat, no longer a sound of pain, but a scream that was not human. It was a shriek of pure, unadulterated agony, of primal rage, and of the final horrifying loss of herself. I was frozen, a statue of pure terror, watching the impossible happen. Lena's scream tore through the cabin as her body began its violent, blasphemous reconstruction. I heard a series of dry, cracking sounds like a bundle of sticks being snapped as her spine elongated, forcing her into a crouch. Her fingers stretched, joints popping and dislocating with wet, sickening noises, the nails darkening, thickening, and sharpening into wicked black claws that scraped against the wooden floor. Her face, the face I had kissed 1,000 times, was pulled and distorted as if by an invisible hand. Her jaw unhinged and stretched forward, the skin tearing at the corners of her mouth to make way for teeth that were no longer human. They grew, yellowed, and sharp, pushing through her bleeding gums. Coarse, dark fur, the color of dried blood and shadow, sprouted from her skin, first in patches, then in a thick, wiry mat that covered her entire writhing form. The process was a symphony of sickening sounds, the rip of sinew, the grind of bone, the wet tearing of flesh, all of it underscored by that continuous, agonized shriek that was slowly losing every trace of her voice, becoming a guttural, bestial howl. For a single, terrifying second, the transformation paused. The creature, the thing that had been my wife, lifted its newly formed head and looked directly at me. Its eyes, now a solid, luminous yellow, held no recognition. I searched them, desperate for a flicker of Lena, a sign of her fear, a silent plea for help. There was nothing. Only a cold, alien depth filled with a bottomless, predatory hunger. The last piece of her was gone. She was gone. Then it lunged. Adrenaline finally broke my paralysis. I threw myself sideways, crashing over a chair as the monster slammed into the wall where I'd been standing. Plaster and splinters exploded inward. Its claws, inches from my face, left 5 deep parallel gouges in the wood. The sheer power of it was staggering. This wasn't a fight I could win. I was prey. Scrambling backward on all fours, I fumbled for purchase on the floor, my boots slipping in a slick of something. I didn't dare look. The creature righted itself, shaking its shaggy head, and let out a guttural snarl that vibrated through the floorboards. It took a step toward me, its long limbs unfolding. I saw my chance. The bathroom. It was my only hope. I surged to my feet and sprinted, diving through the doorway just as its claws swiped the air behind me, tearing 3 long strips from the back of my shirt. I slammed the flimsy wooden door shut and fumbled with the old-fashioned brass bolt, ramming it home a fraction of a second before the creature hit the other side with the force of a battering ram. The entire frame shuddered. The cheap hollow-core door buckled inward. I threw my full weight against it, my shoulders screaming in protest. A splintered hole appeared at eye level as a single black claw punched straight through the wood. I flinched back with a cry, pressing myself into the far corner of the small, dark room. The assault began, a relentless, frenzied barrage of snarling, scratching, and pounding. The sound was deafening, a cacophony of animalistic rage and splintering wood. The door groaned and cracked, chips and splinters flying from the frame. I huddled in the darkness, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard I thought it would break. My life, our life, was being dismantled on the other side of that door. For hours, I listened to the symphony of destruction, the shattering of glass as it smashed the windows, the heavy, rhythmic thudding as it tore apart the furniture we'd picked out together, the screech of its claws on the floorboards, the tearing of the sofa cushions, the crash of the television, the splintering of our dining table. At some point, mixed in with the cacophony, I heard the rending crash of the front door being torn from its hinges. Then a long, triumphant howl that receded into the night, toward the deep woods. Silence descended. A thick, ringing silence that was somehow more terrifying than the noise. I stayed in the dark, my body trembling uncontrollably for what felt like an eternity. I waited until the first pale, gray light of dawn filtered through the tiny frosted window above the shower. A night had passed. A single night that had aged me a decade. With a hand that shook so badly I could barely control it, I slid the bent brass bolt back. I pushed the door open. It scraped against the floor, its lower half shredded to ribbons. The sight that greeted me was one of utter devastation. It wasn't our home anymore. It was a wreckage site. Our life had been torn to shreds and scattered across the floor. Furniture was reduced to kindling. The walls were scarred with deep claw marks. Clumps of coarse, dark fur were snagged on the splinters. The front door was gone, leaving a gaping hole that looked out onto the silent, waiting forest. I stumbled through the ruins, my feet crunching on broken glass and shattered pottery. My eyes fell on my hunting rifle still in its rack on the one wall that remained mostly untouched. I took it down, my movements stiff and automatic. I checked the magazine, chambered around, and stepping over the threshold of my ruined home, I walked into the woods. The forest floor told a story of violence. As a ranger, I was trained to read the land, and the signs were horrifyingly clear. The tracks were immense, a hybrid of a canine paw and a human foot, pressed deep into the loam. They showed me the monster's path. Here it had leaped an astonishing distance, clearing a fallen log over 10 feet high. There, a thick branch on an oak tree, a good 15 feet up, was snapped clean in two, evidence of a pounce. This wasn't just a beast. It was an apex predator, perfectly designed for this terrain. I followed the trail for nearly a mile, my rifle held at the ready, my senses screaming. The tracks led me to a small, sun-dappled clearing. The scene there was a diptych of horror and a twisted sort of peace. In the center of the clearing lay the mangled carcass of a large mule deer, its body ripped open, its blood staining the grass a dark, glistening crimson. And curled up beside it, sleeping in the soft morning light, was Lena. She was naked, her body covered in a sickening mixture of dirt, leaves, and drying blood. The deer's, I prayed. For a moment she looked like a child, peaceful and innocent against the backdrop of the slaughter she had wrought. The juxtaposition was a physical blow, threatening to shatter what little sanity I had left. I approached slowly, quietly. I took off my jacket and gently draped it over her. Her eyes fluttered open. They were her eyes again, brown, human, and utterly lost. They darted from my face to her own blood-caked hands, then to the eviscerated deer. A wave of comprehension and pure, soul-deep horror washed over her features. "Mark," she whispered, her voice a raw, broken thing. I don't remember." Her words dissolved into racking sobs, the cries of someone who has woken up at the scene of their own crime. I didn't say a word. I just lifted her into my arms and carried her back toward the wreckage of our home. We didn't speak of it. The silence was a living entity in the cabin, more powerful than any words could be. Together we moved through the debris field that had been our living room. We swept up the broken glass. We hauled the splintered remains of our furniture out to the yard to be burned. It was a silent, shared penance. While clearing the debris near the front door, I found a scrap of her nightgown, the one she'd been wearing before the change. It was snagged on a nail, a tiny, poignant relic of the woman she had been. I folded it carefully and put it in my pocket. The next month was a new kind of hell. We lived in a state of suspended dread, the next full moon looming on the horizon like a storm cloud. Lena was a ghost. She stopped painting. Her canvases sat untouched, gathering dust. She barely ate, picking at her food, her eyes hollow. She would sit for hours, just staring at the wall, lost in a guilt so profound it was physically crushing her. She knew what she was: a time bomb. A monster in waiting. A week before the next full moon, I started my preparations. I wasn't rebuilding. I was fortifying. I drove into town and bought the heaviest lumber I could find and boarded up the windows, leaving only narrow slits for light. I went to a specialty hardware store and ordered a custom-built solid steel door with a deadbolt system designed for a bank vault. I bought heavy-gauge steel chains and industrial-grade padlocks. I was turning our home, our sanctuary, into a prison. My prison. Her cage. The work was hard, physical labor that left me exhausted, but it was a welcome distraction from the gnawing terror in my gut. I worked from sunup to sundown, the sounds of my hammer, and saw the only things breaking the oppressive silence between us. 3 days before the moon was full, as I was testing the fit of the new steel door, Lena spoke. Her voice was flat, devoid of all emotion, a dead thing. "It's going to be worse this time, Mark." I stopped working, my hand resting on the cold steel. I didn't turn to look at her. "I can feel it," she continued, her voice a monotone whisper. "It's stronger now. It learned from being trapped. It wants out. It's hungrier." It wasn't a plea or a warning. It was a statement of fact, a diagnosis, a death sentence for whoever was unlucky enough to be in its path, and a life sentence for me, its warden. The day after I finished installing the steel door, a government-issue pickup truck rumbled up my driveway. A woman stepped out, trim and confident in her Park Service uniform. She had sharp, intelligent eyes and a no-nonsense air about her. She was the new variable I hadn't accounted for. "Mark Riley?" she asked, extending a hand. "Emily Vance. I'm your new neighbor, so to speak. Just got assigned to the central station." Behind her in the truck, I could see 2 younger faces, interns by the look of them. "Ben, Carla," she called over her shoulder without looking. "You 2 head down to the south cordon. I want that sensor grid calibrated by sundown. I'll meet you there later." They nodded and drove off, leaving us alone. The maneuver was efficient, explaining why she might be working in my sector alone without raising suspicion. Her eyes swept over my cabin, taking in the boarded-up windows and the formidable new door. A small, curious smile played on her lips. "Expecting a grisly invasion?" she joked. "Something like that," I said, my voice flat. "Better safe than sorry out here." My tone was intentionally unwelcoming, a verbal no trespassing sign, but it didn't seem to deter her. "I'll say," she mused, her gaze lingering on the fortifications. She unslung a laptop bag from her shoulder. "Listen, I know this is your territory, but I'm running a new predator tracking program. High-density GPS collaring and game camera placement. We're trying to get a handle on some anomalous population shifts." She booted up the laptop, showing me a map of the park overlaid with tracking data. She clicked on a file, and a photo appeared on the screen. It was a close-up of a GPS collar, still attached to the neck of a tranquilized bear. There were deep, thin scratches gouged into the hardened plastic casing. "See this?" she said, pointing. "The lab guys are stumped. Too fine for a cougar's claws, too deep and sharp for another bear. It's just weird." A cold knot formed in my stomach. She was looking for a ghost, and she was starting in my backyard. Over the next few days, Emily became a constant, unwelcome presence. She was a consummate professional, moving through the woods with a quiet efficiency that I had to respect. She set up her game cameras on major trails, camouflaging them expertly against tree trunks and rock formations. Several of them were placed on the animal paths less than a quarter-mile from my cabin. She was, unknowingly, setting a trap for a monster she couldn't conceive of. I watched her, my gut twisting with a toxic mix of fear and a desperate, insane urge to just tell her everything. I tried to interfere. While on a patrol, I accidentally bumped a tree where she'd mounted a camera, knocking it to the ground. I reported it as animal damage. The next day, she was back, replacing it with a new one, this time housed in a reinforced steel case. The night of the full moon arrived like a death sentence. The air grew cold and still. Lena had already retreated into herself, her body beginning to tremble with the pre-transitional tremors. I led her to the master bedroom, the room with the fewest windows and the strongest walls. I didn't say goodbye. There was nothing left to say. I closed the heavy oak door, slid 3 thick steel bolts into place, and padlocked it for good measure. I sat in the living room, rifle across my lap, listening. The transformation was quicker this time, the screams more furious. Then the assault began. For hours, the creature that was Lena slammed itself against the reinforced door, the wood groaning and splintering but holding. The steel bolts held. The padlock held. Then, just after midnight, the pounding on the bedroom door stopped. An unnerving silence fell over the cabin. I held my breath, straining to hear. The silence was broken by a sound from a different direction. A sharp, explosive crack of splintering wood. It came from the far side of the house. Another crash, and another. It wasn't trying to get through the door. It was smarter now. I ran to the back of the cabin just in time to hear a final, deafening roar of splintering studs and siding. The creature had simply punched its way through the exterior wall of the house. It had torn a jagged, man-sized hole right through the timber and insulation and escaped into the forest, driven by a hunger that my prison could not contain. Dawn broke, painting the sky in mocking shades of pink and gold. I was a hollowed-out man, filled with nothing but cold fury and a terrifying sense of failure. The monster was loose. My prison had failed. I grabbed my rifle and plunged into the forest, following the path of destruction it had left in its wake. The search was frantic, desperate. I pushed myself harder, faster, ignoring the branches that whipped at my face. A new fear, colder and sharper than any I'd known before, was taking root in my heart. It wasn't just hungry for deer anymore. It had been caged. It was angry. I found them about 2 miles from the cabin, in a ravine not far from a popular hiking trail. The scene was a tableau of absolute carnage. The remains of two people, a man and a woman in hiking gear, lay scattered across the forest floor. They hadn't just been killed, they'd been butchered. And in the middle of it all, once again, was Lena. She was unconscious this time, collapsed against a tree, her body and face smeared with blood that was not her own. My blood ran ice cold. This changed everything. This wasn't a local problem anymore. This was a federal case. The FBI would be here. Investigators, forensics teams, media. They would swarm this forest. They would find the tracks. They would find the inconsistencies. They would find me. A dark, frantic clarity took hold. Before I could even think about Lena, I had to erase the monster. I spent the next hour working in a frenzy of cold, calculated panic. I used a heavy branch to scuff and obliterate the creature's distinctive tracks around the bodies. I worked my way outward in a spiral, destroying every print, every sign of its passage. From a pouch on my belt, I took out a small bag of grizzly bear fur I'd collected from rubbing trees, a tool of the trade for scent masking when observing wildlife. I scattered it around the scene, creating a false narrative for the investigators who would inevitably come. I used the butt of my rifle to make deep, round impressions in the earth, mimicking a bear's paw. It was a dark and desperate act, a perversion of all my skills as a ranger, tampering with a murder scene to protect a murderer I loved. Only when I was satisfied that I'd done all I could did I go to Lena. I lifted her into my arms and began the grim, soul-crushing journey home. My mind was numb, my body moving on autopilot. I was so focused on my grim task, on the weight of her in my arms, that I didn't see it. A small, camouflaged box strapped to a pine tree, its lens pointed directly at the path. Emily Vance started her rounds that morning with a thermos of coffee and a sense of professional satisfaction. Her grid was up and running. She made her way from camera to camera, swapping out the memory cards. When she got to the one on the trail near my cabin, the one in the reinforced case, she noticed the path was more disturbed than usual. Back at her station, she plugged the card into her laptop. She scrolled through a dozen images of deer and a curious raccoon. Then she froze. The image was time-stamped just over an hour ago. It was grainy, shot in the low light of early morning, but the content was sickeningly clear. There I was, Mark Riley, my face a mask of exhaustion and despair, emerging from the woods. And in my arms, I was carrying a naked woman. Her body was limp, her skin covered in what was unmistakably a large amount of blood. Emily's face went pale. The coffee cup slipped from her fingers, splashing across the floor. She stared at the screen, her scientific mind racing through every possible rational explanation and finding none that weren't horrific. She grabbed the laptop. 10 minutes later, her truck screeched to a halt in my driveway. She burst out, not even bothering to close the door, and stormed toward me, holding the laptop like a weapon. I was standing by the gaping hole in my wall, staring into nothing. "Mark! What the hell is this?" she yelled, her voice shaking with a mixture of fear and fury. She shoved the laptop into my face. "I saw the bodies on the emergency scanner. 2 hikers found dead. And now this? I'm calling the sheriff, Mark. Right now!" The sight of the photo, the accusation in her eyes, the mention of the bodies, it was too much. The walls I had built inside my mind, the lies, the denial, it all came crashing down. I was trapped, cornered. I looked from the impossible image on the screen to the jagged hole in my house, to the deep claw marks scarring the wood around it. The strength to lie anymore had vanished. A ragged, broken sound escaped my lips. "You don't understand. I croaked, my voice finally breaking. It wasn't me. It was her. I told her everything. The attack, the impossible healing, the transformation, the prison, the escape. The words poured out of me in a torrent of madness and grief. She listened, her anger slowly being replaced by a look of dawning, horrified disbelief. She looked at me, a broken man confessing to a fairy tale, then at the physical evidence all around us. The hole in the wall, the shredded door, the absolute despair in my eyes. And in that moment, she knew. She knew I was telling the truth. An awful, impossible, world-breaking truth. Emily stood there for a long time, the laptop hanging forgotten at her side. The gears were turning behind her intelligent eyes, her scientific mind grappling with a reality that defied every law she knew. I expected her to run, to call for backup, to have me committed. Instead, she took a deep breath, her face set with a grim resolve I recognized in myself. "I don't know what this is, Mark," she said, her voice low and steady. "But if what you're saying is true, we have to contain it, and we have to understand it." It was an alliance born not of trust, but of shared, terrifying knowledge. A part of her, the scientist, was captivated by the impossible. The other part, the human being, was moved by the raw, naked tragedy of my situation. In the weeks leading up to the third full moon, we worked. Emily threw herself into research, scouring scientific databases for anything. Rare prionic diseases, undiscovered retroviruses, anything that could explain this. She found nothing. The only parallels were in the folklore books I'd already shown her, in the whispers and myths of ancient peoples. Science had no answer for the monster in my house. Lena's condition deteriorated rapidly. The transformations were taking a brutal toll. In her human form, she was a wreck. Her bones, having been broken and reshaped twice, were a constant source of agony. They were riddled with microfractures that never properly healed. She suffered from seizures, violent epileptic fits where her body would thrash and convulse, a horrifying echo of the change. She was fading, the woman I loved being physically erased by the thing that lived inside her. We needed a new plan, a better prison, the basement. It was small, windowless, with thick concrete walls. "We anchor her to the floor," I said, the words tasting like ash. "A single, central point, no walls to punch through." The plan was desperate. I bought a heavy-duty forged steel anchor bolt, the kind used for mooring boats, and a bag of fast-setting concrete. Emily watched, her face pale, as I used a sledgehammer to smash a hole in the center of the basement floor. I set the anchor and mixed the concrete, pouring it into the hole. "Will it have enough time to cure?" she asked, her voice tight with anxiety. The moon was only 2 days away. "It has to," I replied, smoothing the wet cement with a trowel. I knew it was a risk. Concrete needs weeks to reach its full compressive strength. We only had 48 hours, but it was our only chance. The night before the moon, Lena had a moment of startling lucidity. I was sitting by her bed, changing the dressing on a pressure sore that had formed on her back. Her eyes, usually clouded with pain or a dull emptiness, focused on me. "It's calling him," she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. "Calling who, Lena?" I asked, my heart seizing. "The first one. The one that bit me." Her eyes were wide with a terror that was ancient and profound. "It isn't just about hunger anymore, Mark. It's lonely. It wants a mate. It wants to make a pack." The words chilled me to the bone. This wasn't just a series of random attacks. It was a beginning. The next night, we led a shuffling, compliant Lena down the basement stairs. The air was cold and damp. The new concrete around the anchor bolt was still dark, not fully cured. We did what we had to do. We wrapped the heavy steel chains around her waist and limbs, securing them with industrial padlocks to the eye of the anchor bolt. She didn't fight. She just watched us with dead eyes. We left her there and went upstairs, the slam of the heavy basement door echoing like a gunshot. The transformation began on schedule. The screams were worse this time, filled with a new note of frustration and rage. We listened as the monster thrashed against its chains, the steel links groaning and straining. For hours it fought, its roars of fury shaking the very foundations of the house. Then the thrashing stopped. A different sound rose from the basement. It wasn't a roar of anger. It was a long, deep, resonant howl. It was a summons. A call sent out into the silent, moonlit world. We waited, hearts pounding. For a long minute, there was only silence. And then, from deep in the woods, impossibly far away, came the answer. A lower, guttural, more powerful howl that drifted through the trees and seeped through the walls of our cabin. Emily and I stared at each other, our faces masks of pure horror. "Oh God," she whispered, her voice trembling. She called him. The answering howl galvanized me. Panic gave way to a cold, grim purpose. "Upstairs, now," I ordered Emily. We barricaded the main floor, shoving the last remaining heavy bookcase against the new steel door. I grabbed my hunting rifle. The shells I loaded into it were my own creation, a desperate fusion of old-world superstition and modern ballistics. I'd spent an evening melting down my grandfather's silver dollars in a crucible over the forge, carefully pouring the molten metal into the hollow points of heavy Brennicky slugs. Each cartridge was a prayer and a curse, a piece of my family's history weaponized against the nightmare that had destroyed it. We killed the lights and waited by a boarded-up window, peering through a narrow slit. He came out of the woods not with a savage rush, but with a terrifying deliberation. The moonlight glinted off a massive dark form that moved with an unnatural grace. The sire. It rose to its full height, over 7 feet tall, its powerful form silhouetted against the trees. It stood on its hind legs, head held high, sniffing the air. There was an intelligence in its posture, a calculating stillness that was far more terrifying than mindless rage. It didn't charge the house. It began to circle it, a predator assessing a trap. It moved silently, a shadow gliding along the perimeter, testing the air, its burning yellow eyes scanning for any weakness. It was playing with us. I saw my chance when it paused near the jagged hole in the wall, the one Lena had made. It peered into the darkness of the cabin, its long snout twitching. I rested the rifle on the windowsill, took a deep breath to steady my hands, and squeezed the trigger. The roar of the rifle was deafening in the enclosed space. The silver-cored slug hit the creature high on its flank. It wasn't like a normal gunshot wound. The flesh sizzled, and a plume of acrid black smoke erupted from the point of impact. The monster let out a deafening roar of pain and fury, staggering back a few steps. But it didn't fall. It didn't run. The silver heard it, but it only made it angrier. From the basement, Lena's creature form heard the cry of its master. A new frenzied wave of violence erupted below us. The chains clanged and strained with renewed, impossible force. She was fighting to get to him, to protect him. The sire, enraged, abandoned all stealth. It launched itself at the steel front door, its weight and power making the entire cabin shudder. The hinges groaned, but held. I chambered another round, trying to get a clear shot through the slit in the boards. The monster slammed against the door again and again, the rhythmic booming a countdown to our doom. "Mark!" Emily's shriek came from the basement door. Her face was as white as a sheet. "The bolt! The concrete! It's not holding!" I looked and my blood ran cold. A network of fine cracks was spreading across the surface of the hastily poured concrete patch. With each new surge of fury from the creature below, the cracks widened. I aimed my rifle back at the front door as the sire hit it again. Then came the sound from the basement. Not the clang of steel, but the sickening, grinding crunch of failing concrete. With a final explosive crack, the anchor bolt, chains and all, was ripped from the floor, taking a huge chunk of the new concrete with it. Lena Monster was free. Dragging the heavy block of concrete behind her, she hurtled up the basement stairs. She didn't hesitate. With a single brutal impact, she smashed the reinforced basement door off its hinges and charged into the room. Her yellow eyes blazing, driven by a primal instinct to defend her sire. I was trapped. A pincer movement from a nightmare. In front of me, the alpha monster, the sire, was tearing its way through a steel door. Behind me, the creature that wore my wife's soul was thundering into the room, a chaos of chains and rage. I had a single silver bullet in the chamber, a fraction of a second to choose. The choice was obvious. Kill the source. End the plague. The steel door finally gave way with a screech of tortured metal bending inward at the top. The sire forced its massive head and shoulders through the gap, its yellow eyes burning with malevolent intelligence locked onto mine. It was a perfect shot. Unmissable. The end of everything. My finger tightened on the trigger. In that sliver of a second, a dark shape blurred past me. Lena Monster didn't leap at me. She didn't attack Emily. She launched herself across the room and planted her body directly between my rifle barrel and the trapped sire. She stood there, a living shield, her back to the monster she was protecting. She faced me, her own body blocking my shot. A low, guttural growl rumbled in her chest, a clear, unmistakable warning. Don't. Time stopped. I stared into those luminous yellow eyes, the monster's eyes. But for the first time, I saw something else in them. Not recognition, not the Lena I knew. But I saw an instinct so powerful, so absolute. It resembled something human. It was loyalty. A twisted, horrifying parody of the devotion she once had for me, now directed at the beast that had made her. She was protecting her pack, protecting her alpha. I couldn't do it. My finger, which a moment ago was ready to deliver death, went limp. I couldn't shoot through what was left of her. I couldn't be the one to pull the trigger on the last, horrifying echo of my wife. In that moment, I knew that my love for her, or the memory of it, was a deeper curse than the one that flowed in her veins. With a groan that felt like it was tearing out of my soul, I slowly, deliberately lowered the rifle. The growl in Lena's chest subsided. Seeing the threat was gone, she turned her head toward the sire. They exchanged a low, throaty sound, a form of communication I could never comprehend. Then, the sire wrenched itself free from the mangled door. Without a backward glance, the two of them, the master and its new mate, disappeared into the darkness of the forest. The cabin was silent, save for the wind whistling through the broken door. Emily rushed to my side. I stood like a man carved from stone, my arms hanging uselessly, the heavy rifle a dead weight. "Why?" she cried, her voice cracking with disbelief and horror. "Mark, you had the shot. Why did you let them go?" I didn't look at her. I couldn't. My gaze was fixed on the black, empty space where they had vanished. My voice, when it came, was a hollow whisper. carrying the weight of every future victim, every life that would be lost because of my choice. Because I still love my wife. We stood together in the ruins of my home, two sentinels at the edge of a new, darker world. We both knew the truth. There weren't just rogue monsters in the woods anymore. There was a pack. And the blame for every scream, every drop of blood they would spill from this night forward, rested on my shoulders. It was my burden. My quiet, eternal watch. From somewhere deep in the Sequoia Ridge, a howl rose into the night air. A moment later, it was joined by another. The two sounds intertwined, rising and falling together, a terrifying, triumphant duet that signaled the birth of a new plague in the heart of the ancient forest.